Hello to my friends, family, and audience in India, America, and abroad. This is India Insight with Sunny Sharma. My YouTube channel is called Sunny Sharma at India Insight Movement. Today, I wanted to do um, a examination of a book I read called "The Movements of the New Left, 1950 to 1975: A Brief History with Documents" by Van Goes. This is a part of the Bedford series in History and Culture. It's a part of a series of texts which highlight important documents. In this case, there were 45 historical documents in this text of a central text of the New Left movement, which encompasses the civil rights as well as other movements. And really, before delving into those documents in a future podcast, I first want to do an introduction to the text of why really setting the historical and political context for why these documents are important. So here we go. The movement of the New Left, 1950 to 1975, was linked and characterized especially by young people advocating for individual dignity as it relates to the realization of full citizenship for all Americans in a variety of struggles centered around civil rights, black power, women and gay liberation, and most emphatically, the anti-Vietnam War movement. It's important to understand the precedent of the old left to understand the historical challenges the new left confronted. As the author Ghost relates, then from the 1880s through the 1940s, the old left of socialists, communists, and anarchists focused on class struggle against industrial capitalism. The New Left also involved the central role of achieving economic justice for the marginalized, but it went further in demanding a whole host of other rights. For the first time in history, the whole world was watching these movements or travesties of injustice, and young people/leaders organized around this premise as an effective means of achieving their legislative goals. It is quite apparent that the New Left generation of 1950 to 1975 understood something I related in my Black History podcast. Change was inevitably going to come. All that was needed was an organized push from the bottom. The 1940s and 1950s set the foundation for these movements, whether it was McCarthyism's blacklisting of communists or the March on Washington for the rights of black soldiers instigated by the African American labor leader Asa Randolph. Despite the rise of many black leaders who set the intellectual foundations for deeper investigations and actions in the 1960s, the 1950s saw little progress in terms of civil rights. Nonetheless, people began to organize around the premise for the need of deeper equality that had been promised centuries before, setting the stage for more provocative civil disobedience. Arguably, many progressive presidents were receptive and responsive to the currents of change, even if it wasn't inherently founded upon altruism. For example, the Kennedy administration encouraged Northern charitable foundations to set up the Voter Education Project to fund voter registration so as to discourage high-profile campaigns such as the Freedom Rides. Such forms of civil disobedience in the South that were led by young college students like John R. Lewis were extremely dangerous, and the U.S. government, led by President JFK, understood the gravity and risk of these endeavors. During this time, a more radical and militant student body was forming in colleges across America, especially in California and places like Berkeley, where students were questioning the tenets of capitalist society. Goss brings up the question that, were students being trained to be cogs in the machine of corporate capitalism, and if so, what could they do about it? It was apparent to many young people that in spite of America's great economic prosperity post-1945 World War II, many people were still being left behind. More markedly, the American project in egalitarianism was yet to be expanded to all people, as was the promise of the U.S. Constitution, later to be articulated by civil rights leaders/nonviolent strategists like James Lawson and stern constitutional experts like President Obama. A turning point not just during the New Left movement, but in American history was on the horizon. The 3 years from 1965 to 1968 saw the rise of the anti-Vietnam War movement, Black Power, and women's liberation movements. Both new pedagogy and novel methods of organizing were being experimented on most prolifically during the 1960s and possibly any other period of American history, as represented by such books like Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961 by Frantz Fanon, that inspired Black Power proponents and militants, and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published in 1968 by the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, which ignited similar revolutionary sentiment founded upon certain radical theoretical principles. But so also was put into question the legitimacy of unwarranted, cruel, and unusual foreign enterprises like the Vietnam War. Many Americans began questioning the morality of the world's strongest military, exerting its full force on a small peasant country. In many ways, the logic of this wide-scale protest was a reversal of the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, the most widely read pamphlet/book of the American Revolutionary period, Common Sense, by Thomas Paine, stated a small island nation governed by England should not coerce or subjugate a much bigger colonial landmass, the 13 colonies, in America. In 1966, American protesters proclaimed that a large and powerful nation, America, should not oppress a much smaller and weaker country, Vietnam. This train of thought that an overseas military venture was not only destructive to lives, but hurt economic outcomes in America would be a trademark of U.S. social discourse even today. This anti-war movement grew steadily from 1965 to 1967, when in 1967 Dr. King took up a very unpopular moral opposition to the Vietnam War in his infamous Riverside speech in New York. For clarity, this anti-war movement was composed of a minority of dissenters, including only a handful in Congress willing to challenge the president. And this Riverside Church speech, I'll discuss more in a future podcast because it's one of the most important documents from that time period. Another movement that sprouted in numerous cities in the 1960s, from Detroit, Chicago, Oakland, and Cleveland, was the provocative notion of Black Power. Black Power drew inspiration not only from Third World anti-imperialist struggles and the Nation of Islam's call for self-reliance, it was also influenced by the new Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee SNCC chairman who succeeded John R. Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, the founder and chairman of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton, and the most influential figure of all, the martyred Malcolm X. Malcolm X railed against the U.S. government imposed social problems plaguing minority communities that was directly related to the lack of economic ownership and political power for Black communities across America. This shared sentiment meant to many Black leaders calling for universal franchise, the demand for representation became a central focus of the movement. This need for representation was felt strongly by many women who, in late 1967, the first radical feminist small group was founded in Chicago. It was called simply the West Side Group. Although the word radical is used often, in this case, the intelligence of their organization lay in the preference for horizontal collaboration rather than a hierarchical organization. It was this very hierarchy in everyday life that they sought to dismantle, similar to anarchism. In the later period of this movement, from 1969 to 1975, there is much insight into the fight against militarism, poverty, and the call for Black electoral representation that many assassinated leaders, if not directly alluded to, did indeed provide the moral imagination and tactics to construct a new society. Many organizers felt a revolution was coming, and indeed the previous Great Society legislation passed from 1963 to 1968 was indeed revolutionary, in just how broadly it affected marginalized Americans and empowered the next generation. However, though new groups of people were gaining visibility due to the efforts of a few, the rise of neoliberalism would indicate the rise in counter-revolutionary forces to the changes instigated by what could only be described as a broad rainbow coalition, a term associated today with one of the most important voices of Black radical community development, the chair of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. These were, quote, all the invisible people, African Americans, Chicanos, Native Americans, Puerto Ricans, Asian Americans, gay liberationists, and radical and lesbian feminists who all demanded power, including poor whites. Such diversity of perspectives channeled into the anti-war movement led to some of the largest demonstrations in cities across America, especially in Washington, D.C., where in November 1969, 500,000 people gathered in the largest anti-war rally to date. In April 1971, 800 Vietnam veterans against the war, VVAW, led by Navy Lieutenant John Kerry, threw away their medals on the steps of the Capitol. The following May, even though anti-war was a fringe movement growing in popularity, the largest expression of civil disobedience took place in American history, whereby 12,000 members of the May Day tribe were arrested for trying to shut down Washington, D.C. My question: do we have the moral imagination, tactics, and understanding of public policy to do the same thing today? While the war was coming to an end and was seen as a triple defeat, politically, militarily, and morally for America, the Black Power movement was confronting opposition from President Nixon, who was in pursuit of a Southern strategy that was openly hostile to African American freedom. To some extent, the general political tactic to counter such traditional despotism has remained the same. For decades, civil rights and Black Power leaders had advocated that African Americans assert themselves as a voting bloc to control city services and jobs. The number of African Americans in Congress increased from 6 in 1964 to 13 in 1970. Although this electoral representation is far from Reconstruction levels, it set the foundation for future Black political leaders who have dramatically changed American political culture. Educational culture was also radically altered through the anti-imperial ethos of the Third World Liberation Fronts, TWLFS, organized by students from San Francisco State University and Berkeley in late 1968 and early 1969. They not only fostered Third World identity linked to liberation struggles in the Third World, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, they also led strikes to demand the creation of ethnic study programs to empower minority groups. This was particularly prominent among Black academics like Dr. Amiri Bakara, Dr. Angela Davis, Dr. Bell Hooks, etc. Forced assimilation of indigenous people in the U.S. in the 1950s resulted in hundreds of distinct tribes created a pan-Indian identity called the Red Power movement during the 1960s. Although this unity of diverse groups or tribes did occur, there also were stark divisions among many fronts of struggle. Two gay liberation struggles grew out of the late 1960s with differing approaches. One, the Gay Liberation Front, which is intensely suspicious of hierarchy, written rules, and structures, like many women liberation organizations. And two, the Gay Activist Alliance, which not only had a complex committee structure with formal decision making, it also was the blueprint for other gay rights organizations in the 1970s. Concluding insights and thoughts. Goss holds that the rise of many movements in the late 1960s and early 1970s that were separate from one another meant during these years there was a failed attempt to build a unified revolutionary movement for an assault on capitalism, imperialism, and the US government itself. The nature of the challenges that the old left and new left faced were very different, making it difficult for scholars and laymen alike to assess just how revolutionary were their achievements, whether it was economic justice or expanding the notion of citizenship rights to more people. This is obviously a simplification, but as I delve deeper in some of the 45 documents in this book in a future podcast, it will become evident that the New Left movement was perhaps in many ways the most American of all the leftist movements because it directly challenged the tenets of American democracy concerning citizenship as outlined in America's founding documents and the Constitution. The period of abolition challenged the universal injustice of slavery, while the Old Left movement was a fight against international fascism, imperialism, and the economic injustice that fueled such despotism. The New Left movement of 1950 to 1975 also encompassed these problems, but in the increasingly globalized and connected world, the New Left didn't just challenge the notion of citizenship and the political and economic advantages it granted. This movement also challenged our impetus towards inclusivity, belonging, and acceptance. This is demonstrated physically through civil disobedience and labor strikes, and intellectually through the literature from the time period, whether it was Du Bois, Baldwin, Ellison, and others. In his introduction, Ghost relates some final insights concerning the established legislative revolution that by law and custom has made discrimination illegal on paper. First, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 together marked a revolutionary change in extending full citizenship to all Americans. In many ways, it was the first time in American history, as I've related before, that universal franchise was granted to all people, including Black women. The stark reality of power that Goss wants readers to internalize is the fact that President JFK, President LBJ, and Congress did not initiate these great reforms. Instead, they supported them late and under enormous pressure from a powerful movement led by African Americans. Black organizers and leaders opened the door of political opportunity for many other groups, including a more liberal immigration system established legislatively through the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act. Furthermore, as stated before, these movements were only successful due to grassroots pressure from networks of local communities connected together for a shared purpose of perfecting our union. Our leaders were not always receptive to change without socio-political or economic incentives. American culture has been shaped more by the New Left movement than any other socio-political movement in our history. As Goss concludes in his introduction, its influence is even more deeply embedded in our culture, how we behave, what we assume, the language we use. So, as we delve deeper into the documents, we must ask, was there a revolution of society or of the individual as a consequence of the New Left movement 1950 to 1975? Youth rose up, diversity was exalted, black power and electoral politics became a reality, women demanded a seat at the table, and the 1960s Great Society was passed. What evidence, lessons, and moral imagination will we consider when looking back to carry forth in our own project to foster a new leftist coalition in this country of working class and poor people to defeat the plutocratic oligarchy that has been a definitive reality in America for well over a century? Will America's primary modern-day leftist organization, the Democratic Socialists of America, which has reached close to the same number of members in 2026 this year as the New Left Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, had in the 1970s, 100,000 members, be just as broad and effective while staying dedicated to the working class through their focus on reforming large employers like Amazon, Walmart, and Starbucks? Will there be a renewed politics for the poor through electoral politics today in similar measures to the message of the civil rights movement back then? Thank you for listening to my podcast on the New Left Movement, and I'll be back with a further examination of the 45 critical documents from that time period that really highlight just how important many of the organizations back then were, such as the Black Panther Party, the Student Democratic Society, the anti-war movement against nuclear proliferation, the Young Lords, and I'll go more in depth into that in my future podcast. So thank you, and I'll see you again in another podcast.